Time is a patient executioner. It waits in the corners of empires, whispering promises of eternity to those who believe themselves untouchable. And yet, every throne, no matter how gilded, is built upon the same fragile bones of men and women who forget that crowns rust, and blood remembers, fade to snow, endless, falling over iron gates, over abandoned corridors, over a house that once held the heartbeat of a dynasty. In the stillness of Yekaterinburg, there is a house without music, a room without air. And in that room, a family once smiled for the last time, unaware that history was already sealing the door behind them. They were the children of divine right, the heirs to centuries of empire. The Romanovs, a name that once meant forever, and yet forever ended in silence. Their story is not simply of a fall. It is a requiem for belief, for illusion, for the fragile theater of immortality that all monarchs play upon the stage of time. Tonight, we trace their footsteps, from the golden halls of Petersburg to the cold cellar of their undoing. A journey through devotion, denial, and destiny. For when the crown cracks, it is not only kings who bleed. Before their name became a dirge, it was a hymn. The House of Romanov, architects of empire, guardians of an idea called Russia. From the 17th century's uncertain dawn rose this dynasty, forged in piety and destiny, bound to the belief that God himself had stitched their bloodline into eternity. Mikhail Romanov, the first of the name, crowned in 1613, brought a fractured realm back from the chaos of the time of troubles. The people wept, not for joy, but for relief. From that moment, divine right was more than politics. It was salvation. The Tsar was not merely ruler, he was chosen. Through wars and winters, through famine and fire, the Romanovs learned to wear power like a second skin. Peter the Great dragged Russia into modernity, wrenching her eastward soul toward a Western dream. Catherine the Great danced with enlightenment and conquest alike, leaving behind a realm both magnificent and merciless. By the dawn of the 20th century, Russia stood vast, trembling and uncertain, an empire of contradictions. And at its heart stood Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov, a man raised to rule, but not built to reign. Sound of pen scratching on parchment. Nicholas II was the image of royal restraint, soft-spoken, dutiful, a husband and father first, an emperor second. He loved his family more than his throne, and therein lay the seed of tragedy. To his people, he was little father. To history, he would become the last. He inherited not a crown of glory, but one of ghosts. An empire simmering beneath the illusion of unity. Noblemen fattened on old privilege. Peasants drowning in endless toil. Revolution stirring beneath the soil. The world had changed, but the Tsar had not. The sound of distant protest murmurs fades into the gentle laughter of children. At Tsarskoe Selo, the imperial family lived in a world untouched by hunger or rumor. Alexandra, the empress, born a princess of Hesse, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, carried a heart both fierce and fragile. Her love for Nicholas was absolute, her devotion to her children unyielding, but her foreign tongue, her aloofness, and her desperate faith in mysticism would one day feed the fires of suspicion. Their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, lived within the glass cage of adoration. They were the last blossom of a garden already wilting, unaware that their laughter echoed down the corridors of a dying world. Music grows warmer, nostalgic, strings and piano. There were balls. There were picnics. There were summer evenings by the sea. Photographs show them smiling, radiant, human, ordinary. But history has a cruel sense of irony. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow it casts. Nicholas's faith in autocracy was his inheritance, his anchor, and his undoing. He believed his crown sacred, his duty divine. Even as whispers of change swept across Europe, revolution in France, socialism in Germany, he stood unmoved, sheltered by ritual, guided by tradition. But fate had already begun to stir in the east, a restless spirit cloaked in the red banners of the people. The winds of 1905 carried more than protest. They carried prophecy. When the streets of St. Petersburg ran with the blood of Bloody Sunday, a chasm opened between Tsar and subject that would never close again. Yet Nicholas, ever the believer in destiny, saw not warning but test. He prayed and pressed forward, toward a future that no longer believed in him. Visuals, candlelight on icons, soldiers saluting, a mother praying in silence. The Romanovs stood at the summit of empire, their lineage carved in stone and scripture. But stone can crumble, and faith can fracture. The whispers grew. The world was changing, and soon so would they. Every dynasty begins with the illusion of permanence. Until history asks the question, none can answer. There are moments in history when power no longer glows, it glitters. When faith becomes ceremony and ceremony becomes theater. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Romanovs had perfected the performance of eternity. They ruled not only by decree, but by myth. In palaces of endless corridors, the Tsar's reflection multiplied in the mirrors. One man, infinite illusions. His empire stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, its borders drawn in both snow and blood. A sixth of the earth whispered his name, and yet, behind the veil of ceremony, shadows gathered like dust beneath the throne. Nicholas believed he could command destiny as his ancestors commanded armies. But destiny does not kneel. Music swells, trumpets of triumph echo faintly, then fade beneath murmurs of dissent. It was an age of contradictions. The empire gleamed with progress, railways, industry, invention. But the peasants remained shackled to hunger, the workers to unrest. Each brick of modern Russia was laid upon the bones of the old one. And while Nicholas signed decrees in golden ink, revolutionists wrote manifestos in the blood of the streets. The Empress, Alexandra, sought solace not in politics, but in faith. Her son, Alexei, the fragile heir, bled with every bruise, each drop of crimson a prayer unanswered. The imperial doctors called it hemophilia. The mother called it punishment. In her desperation, she reached for the divine, or what she believed divine. And from the mist of mysticism, one figure emerged, a peasant, a pilgrim, a prophet. Grigory Rasputin. Soft, eerie chant echoes faintly, like distant church hymns twisted by time. Rasputin, the wandering monk from Siberia, entered the palace as a whisper and stayed as a shadow. He spoke of faith, healing, destiny. And in Alexei's brief recoveries, Alexandra saw miracles. To her, he was heaven's messenger. To everyone else, he was the devil in holy cloth. His presence dripped poison into the veins of the court. The nobility despised him, the ministers feared him, the people mocked him. But Alexandra's faith made her blind, and Nicholas's love made him silent. The empire, already trembling, began to rot from within. Visuals shift, candlelit chambers, Rasputin's piercing gaze, letters sealed in wax. Outside the palace gates, discontent grew louder. The Duma demanded reform. Socialists plotted in secret. And still, Nicholas clung to the divine myth of autocracy, believing himself the last guardian of God's order on earth. When war came in 1914, it arrived not as a storm, but as an omen. The Tsar declared his empire's honor bound to the defense of Serbia. Crowds cheered. Bells rang. For a moment, Russia remembered her faith in him. But war is the great unmasker. Beneath the banners of patriotism, hunger sharpened its knives. Millions were sent to the front, unprepared, unequipped, unreturning. The railways broke, the factories starved, and from the frozen trenches came the truth that the empire was bleeding faster than its heir. Nicholas took personal command of the army, a gesture of devotion and of folly. He left his throne to Alexandra, who ruled through Rasputin's counsel. Rumors spread like wildfire. The Tsarina, the German spy, Rasputin, the secret master of Russia, and the Tsar, the absent shepherd of a dying flock, sound of whispering voices, the scratching of pens. Down with the Tsar! Down with Rasputin! In the golden halls, power still glittered, but its light no longer warmed. It blinded. The imperial family, once adored, now became a symbol of decadence, saints in their own mirror, ghosts to their own people. Ministers resigned, generals rebelled, and in December 1916, beneath the chandeliers of a St. Petersburg palace, the nobility made their desperate move. Soft heartbeat sound, rhythmic, tense, Rasputin was invited to dine. They offered him wine laced with cyanide, pastries laced with deceit. But death, it seemed, refused him. Poison failed. Bullets followed. He fell, rose, and fell again, a grotesque ballet between faith and vengeance. When his body finally sank beneath the frozen river, the water closed like a curtain upon the last act of illusion. But it was too late. The spell had broken. And the audience, the people, no longer believed. Fade to sounds of marching boots, distant chants of revolution. Nicholas returned from the front to find his empire already slipping into chaos. The banners of devotion had turned to flags of rebellion. The winter of 1917 brought not frost, but fire. And as the snow melted, so did the centuries of obedience. Power, once a crown, had become a chain. Revolutions rarely arrive like thunder. They creep, soft-footed and unseen, until one morning the sun rises, and everything familiar has vanished. For the Romanovs, that morning came in 1910. Sound of distant crowds chanting, "Bread! Peace! Freedom!" dissolving into static. Petrograd was no longer the city of palaces. It was a furnace of hunger and rage. Factories stood silent, railways broke apart, and soldiers, once the Tsar's loyal sons, laid down their rifles and joined the mob. The empire, stretched across 11 time zones, finally collapsed under the weight of its own prayers. Nicholas was away, still clinging to the mirage of command. Messages reached him like echoes. The Duma defies you. The generals hesitate. The people rise. By the time his train turned back toward Tsarskoye Selo, he was no longer emperor. He was a relic. Music. A somber cello under a tolling bell. In March of 1917, Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov, Tsar of all the Russias, emperor by God's grace, abdicated. He signed the paper with a trembling hand. For the first time in 3 centuries, the House of Romanov no longer ruled the empire they had built. Outside, the world celebrated liberation. Inside the palace, the silence was unbearable. Alexandra clutched her children as though the gesture could hold back history. The soldiers who once saluted now guarded. The servants who once bowed now whispered. Their world had narrowed to a single question. What becomes of divinity when the people stop believing? Soft sound of wind through empty halls. The family was moved, first under house arrest at Tsarskoye Selo, where the gardens still bloomed, but freedom had died. The daughters sewed, read, prayed. Nicholas tended the garden, trimmed the roses, as if normalcy could be resurrected by ritual. Letters from loyalists trickled in, but hope was a dying currency. The provisional government debated their fate. Exile to England was whispered, a sanctuary with their royal cousins. But politics is a creature of appetite, not mercy. Europe turned its gaze away. No ships arrived. Sound of a train whistle, echoing through fog. In August 1917, the Romanovs were sent east, to Tobolsk, in Siberia. Their imperial luggage now carried only memories. The children, wrapped in furs, looked out through frost-stained windows, watching Russia slide away behind them. The journey lasted weeks. When they arrived, the world was smaller still. In Tobolsk, they prayed, wrote diaries, kept to routines as though time still obeyed them. Nicholas chopped wood. Alexandra taught lessons. And yet, even in captivity, there was dignity, the quiet defiance of grace in decay. But in the distance, another revolution was coming, red and ruthless. Sound of gunfire. Faint at first, then nearer. In October 1917, The Bolsheviks seized power. The promise of equality replaced the gospel of empire. To them, the Romanovs were not a family. They were a symbol, and symbols must be destroyed. From that moment, their fate was sealed. The music grows tense, a slow heartbeat beneath faint murmurs. The guards changed. The letters stopped. Winter crept in again, long and merciless. In early 1918, the family was moved once more, deeper into the Ural Mountains, to a place called Yekaterinburg. Their new home, the Ipatiev House. It was officially called the House of Special Purpose. The irony did not escape them. Soft footsteps on wooden floors. The clinking of keys. Their captors were courteous, almost polite. But the house had been prepared not for imprisonment, but for erasure. Windows were painted over, gates reinforced. Every corridor held the hush of unspoken finality. The children still smiled in photographs. Anastasia played the piano, her laughter echoing like light in a well. They believed, or pretended to believe, that this was temporary, that their cousins in Europe would intervene, that mercy still had a face. But outside, the world had turned red. The civil war had begun. The White Army advanced toward Yekaterinburg, and panic began to bloom among the Bolsheviks. To them, the Romanovs were no longer people. They were the ghost of the old world, and ghosts must be buried deep. Sound fades to silence. Then, a single ticking clock. The fracture was complete. Faith had shattered. Empire had dissolved, and the last Tsar and his family stood on the edge of history, unaware that history had already chosen the hour. In their diaries, they still wrote of hope, but hope, like glass, can only shine before it breaks. It is said that every empire dies twice, first when it collapses, and again when it is forgotten. But for the Romanovs, the second death never came. They linger still, in memory, in dust, in whispers beneath the snow. Soft violin notes begin, slow, mournful, almost fragile. Yekaterinburg, the summer of 1918. The Romanovs had been prisoners for months. Their world had shrunk to the walls of the Ipatiev House, a place that smelled of candle wax and quiet dread. The rooms were bare. The floors creaked. Outside, guards smoked and laughed. Inside, the family prayed. Nicholas's beard had grown gray. He still rose at dawn, still bowed before icons, still kissed his wife's hand. Routine had become their last empire. Alexandra's health waned. Her letters, never sent, spoke of forgiveness, of faith, of resignation. Her body trembled, but her belief in divine will remained unbroken. Perhaps that was her strength. Perhaps that was her curse. The children lived as though in a dream that refused to end. Olga read poetry, her mind reaching for beauty beyond walls. Tatiana tended to her mother, disciplined and quiet. Maria drew. Anastasia teased the guards with laughter that made them uneasy. And Alexei, pale, frail, brave, watched the world from his wheelchair, the last heir of a vanished crown. Wind outside. The rustle of trees. Rumors drifted through the guards. The White Army was advancing. Loyalists who sought to reclaim the imperial family. To the Bolsheviks, this could not be allowed. A living Romanov was a living symbol, and symbols are dangerous things. In July, the command came from above. Resolve the question of the Romanovs. No signatures, no ceremony, just an order, heavy with inevitability. The music fades to a low hum, like breath held too long. On the evening of July 16th, the family retired as usual. They prayed, spoke softly, and went to sleep believing, perhaps hoping, that the tide might still turn. Outside, trucks arrived under the cover of darkness. Men carried rifles. The night was unusually still. Footsteps, doors creak open. At 2 in the morning, the guards entered. They woke the family and told them they were to be moved, for their safety. Nicholas nodded. Alexandra crossed herself. The children dressed quickly, clutching pillows and small treasures. Anastasia carried her dog, Jemmy. They were led downstairs into a small, windowless room, the basement. The air was thick, heavy, waiting, the faint hum of electric light. The sound of boots shuffling. Nicholas looked around, puzzled. He turned to the officer in charge, Yakov Yurovsky. He asked if they might bring chairs for his wife and son. They did. Then, silence. Yurovsky read a statement, his voice mechanical. Nikolai Alexandrovich, your relatives have tried to save you. But now, the revolution cannot be threatened by your existence. Nicholas only managed to say, "What? What?" The words never finished. Gunfire erupted. The sudden explosion of sound, deafening, chaotic, echoing in darkness. The room filled with smoke, screams, confusion. The Tsar fell first. Then Alexandra. Then the daughters, some still standing, some still gasping. The diamonds sewn into their corsets, deflecting the first bullets like cruel irony. The soldiers reloaded. The walls turned red. When silence finally returned, it was complete. So complete that even the air seemed afraid to move. Music, a single cello note, sustained and trembling. The bodies were taken that night, loaded onto a truck, driven into the forest outside the city. The road was rough, the wheels heavy with history's burden. At a clearing near a place called Ganina Yama, they dug a pit. The corpses were stripped, burned, doused with acid, buried in haste. The empire that once spanned continents now rested in an unmarked grave. Soft rain begins again, faintly. In the days that followed, the guards drank to forget. The city went on as if nothing had happened. But time remembers. The earth does not forget. Years later, when the Soviet Union rose from the ashes of that same revolution, the story of the Romanovs became forbidden scripture, whispered, denied, then mythologized. The house of special purpose was demolished, but the ground beneath it still murmured in winter. Pause, and in that silence, something eternal remained, not power, not crowns, but the echo of a family that met death not as rulers, but as souls. History is written by the victors, they say, but sometimes it is haunted by the victims. History does not end with death. It breathes in the spaces between remembrance and forgetting, a quiet pulse beneath the centuries. And in those spaces, the Romanovs still wait. Soft orchestral strings rise, fragile and sorrowful. After that night in July 1918, Russia awoke under a new dawn, one painted in red. The world moved on, as it always does. The revolution hardened into regime, the regime into myth, and the myth into silence. For decades, the story of the last Tsar and his family was not told, not fully, not truthfully. Their names were erased from records, their portraits removed from walls. They became ghosts of a forbidden past. But ghosts, when buried, do not disappear. They whisper. In secret, some remembered. Old soldiers carried photographs hidden in coat linings. Nuns in convents prayed for the souls of the unnamed martyrs. And across Russia, candles flickered in windows, tiny rebellions of light. Soft echo of liturgical singing fades beneath narration. The world, too, could not let them go. Whispers of survival spread like frost on glass. Was Anastasia still alive? Had one of the daughters escaped the bullets, fled across the Urals, found refuge under another name? It was hope wrapped in illusion, a longing to believe that innocence could outlive brutality. From Paris to New York, impostors emerged, women claiming to be the lost princess. Some were deluded, others desperate. And yet, the myth endured. Because sometimes myth is kinder than truth. Pause. Music fades to a solitary piano. The truth, however, was patient. In the cold earth outside Yekaterinburg, the bones of history waited. For decades, the Soviet government denied their existence. But in 1979, two men, amateur historians, stumbled upon a grave near the Koptayaki forest. They found bones, fragments, buttons, acid-burned metal, evidence and silence. They buried the secret again, fearing persecution. It would take another decade and the fall of the Soviet Union before the world would finally listen. In 1991, the grave was unearthed. 9 skeletons lay together, the Tsar, the Tsarina, and 3 daughters among them. DNA spoke the truth that time had buried. They had never left. They had never escaped. They had always been there, beneath the quiet soil of their own nation. The missing bodies of Alexei and one of his sisters were found later, in 2007, scattered, burned, but real. After nearly a century of denial, the Romanovs had returned to history not as rulers, but as relics, sound of distant church bells swelling. In 1998, under the gray sky of St. Petersburg, the family was finally laid to rest in the Cathedral of St. Peter and Paul, among the czars of old. The ceremony was solemn, hesitant, haunted by the ghosts of both past and politics. President Boris Yeltsin called it an act of repentance before history. But repentance cannot rewrite the script, only soften the silence. And yet, in that silence, something had changed. The Romanovs were no longer symbols of tyranny, nor martyrs of monarchy. They had become human again. A father, a mother, 5 children. The family that once ruled a sixth of the earth, now at peace beneath it. Music swells, strings and choir in minor harmony. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized them as passion-bearers, saints not for their reign, but for their suffering. Their faces, once printed on coins, now adorned icons in candlelit chapels. Their story, once censored, now whispered through prayers. The empire that had condemned them now bowed its head to them. Such is the irony of time. It forgives, but never forgets. Soft sound of a candle being lit. Their bloodline still lingers in exiled branches, distant relatives scattered across Europe, living quietly under other crowns, other names. But the true legacy of the Romanovs does not lie in lineage. It lies in the lesson their silence left behind. Power, no matter how divine it claims to be, is mortal. Faith, when bound to authority, becomes blindness. And love, even when surrounded by gold, cannot save a world built on illusion. The Romanovs' tragedy was not only in their deaths, it was in the isolation that preceded it, the blindness of belief, the fragility of certainty, the refusal to see that eternity does not belong to mortals. Music fades to near silence. Only wind remains, and so, a century later, the question still lingers. Were they victims of history, or its authors? Saints, sinners, or simply souls caught in the machinery of destiny? Perhaps they were all of these, and none. For in the end, time keeps no crown. It keeps only echoes. Somewhere in Yekaterinburg, snow still falls over the unmarked ground. And if you listen closely, you might still hear their footsteps in the silence. Soft orchestral strings hum beneath the sound of wind through birch trees. A candle flame flickers. Snow falls slowly in the darkness. Time has no mercy. It does not mourn. It simply moves, erasing kingdoms, rewriting names, softening the edges of cruelty until all that remains is memory and silence. The Romanovs believed they were eternal, chosen by heaven, guardians of a sacred order. But eternity is never given. It is borrowed. And when the debt comes due, even kings must pay. Their empire lies buried. Their palaces stand hollow. Their portraits fade behind glass. And yet, a century later, their story still breathes. Not in marble halls or royal archives, but in the quiet ache of history's conscience. For some deaths are so still, they echo forever. The music deepens, a cello weeping softly beneath the narration. Power is a fragile inheritance. It blinds before it breaks. The Romanovs were not the first to believe they were unbreakable, nor will they be the last. For every age builds its own palaces of illusion. Every generation crowns its own idols. And every throne, in time, becomes a monument to its own silence. But within the tragedy, there remains something purely human. A father who loved his children. A mother who prayed for mercy. A family who faced death together, still believing, still hoping that grace might descend even in darkness. And perhaps that is the truest kind of royalty. Soft choir enters, faint and reverent. In the end, their legacy is not carved in power, but in paradox. They were both victims and symbols, saints and sinners, a mirror held up to all who dare to rule or to follow blindly. Their story is a warning whispered through centuries that faith without compassion is tyranny, that love without truth is blindness, and that silence, when it serves injustice, is its own form of sin. Long pause. The music swells, then softens to a single piano note. If you ever stand beneath the domes of Petersburg or walk the forests near Yekaterinburg, close your eyes. You may hear it still, the faint echo of footsteps, the breath of prayers that were never answered, the fragile hum of a world that once believed itself immortal. That sound? Is history remembering what humanity forgot? The candle flickers once more, then goes out, and so the Romanovs did not die in silence. They became the silence, eternal, unbroken, and hauntingly alive, fade to black. The wind fades. One final church bell tolls. End credits roll.